When a tired electrician answered an emergency call at 2 a.m., he thought he was just there to fix a flickering light in a quiet mansion. He didn't expect to find a barefoot heiress with a voice like a prayer, or to be asked, without words, to stay until the darkness passed. In that hush of an old house echoing with secrets, they were two strangers carrying their own heavy stories. He, with the weight of single fatherhood and sleepless nights. She with a legacy she never asked for and a deadline she couldn't escape. What began as a simple repair would become something else entirely, a gentle spark in the silence, an invitation to choose light even when the world demanded shadows. This is the story of how a man who fixed broken things met a woman who needed something real, and how, together, they found the courage to stay. It was 2 a.m. when Darius Jackson's phone buzzed in the dark of his cramped kitchen, the screen's glow cutting through the stillness like a blade. He blinked awake, the worn couch beneath him, a poor substitute for the bed he hadn't touched in days. Outside, the rain drummed a steady rhythm against the window, soft but insistent, like a song only the weary could hear. Darius rubbed his face, feeling the rasp of a day's stubble, and thumbed open the message. Emergency light failure. Circuit overload suspected. 11 to 28 Willow Creek Drive. It was a job, an odd one, in a neighborhood he'd only seen in glossy magazines left behind in waiting rooms. But overtime was overtime, and Bills didn't care what time it was, or how heavy his eyelids felt. He let out a slow breath, the kind that tasted of cold coffee and quiet desperation, and slid his feet into scuffed boots waiting by the door. Before he stepped out, Darius's gaze fell on the baby monitor propped up on the counter. Emmy, his daughter, lay curled up under a quilt patched together by a neighbor's mother, her small face peaceful in the glow of the nightlight. He smiled faintly, a private moment of softness before the weight of the world pressed down again. "I'll be back soon," he whispered to the empty kitchen, a promise meant for her and maybe for himself. The rain came harder as he drove, wipers slashing across the windshield in a rhythmic struggle against the storm. Darius's old work van rattled over potholes, each shudder of the frame reminding him of just how many miles it had carried him through. The job pinged again on his phone, a final nudge to keep moving. 1128 Willow Creek Drive, a place of manicured lawns and gates that seemed designed to keep men like him out. But the system had flagged it as urgent, and that meant double pay, maybe enough for a new pair of shoes for Emmy when hers gave out at the toes. Maybe enough for a breath of relief. By the time he turned onto the long, tree-lined street, the rain had turned the world into a watercolor of shadows and silver. The mansion rose up out of the night like a story he didn't belong in. 3 stories of old money elegance, white columns, and black iron gates that swung open with silent obedience. Darius parked at the curb, his boots sinking slightly in the mud as he stepped out. No barking dogs, no lights in the windows, save for a flicker near the front door. A soft, wavering glow that might have been a trick of the rain, or a sign that someone was still awake. He paused at the threshold. The heavy door cracked open just enough to whisper an invitation he hadn't expected. Most nights he worked in places that smelled of grease and cigarette smoke, where his skin color wasn't an unspoken question hanging in the air. But this place, he didn't know what waited on the other side. Still, he reached for the laminated ID clipped to his jacket, cleared his throat, and recorded a quick voice note for the dispatch log. Arrived on site, no response at the door, entering to assess. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of lemon oil and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to history and the careful polish of a house that was more museum than home. Darius wiped his boots on the mat, habit even in places that wouldn't remember his courtesy, and stepped into the quiet. A grand staircase rose ahead of him, its banister curving like the back of some sleeping creature, and for a moment he just stood there, listening to the hush that pressed in around him. "Hello," he called, his deep voice low and even, echoing off marble floors and centuries-old walls. "Electrician, emergency repair, call out." Nothing, no footsteps, no startled gasp, just the faint hum of wires somewhere deeper in the house, a sound he knew as intimately as his own breath. He followed it, each step careful, each breath measured. The further he walked, the clearer it became that this wasn't a house left empty. It was a house holding its breath. And somewhere in that silence, Darius felt the echo of his own life, the nights spent patching up what others left broken, the endless balancing act of bills and dreams, and the tiny, bright laughter of his daughter that made it all worth it. He found the breaker panel at the end of a narrow hallway, the metal door hanging askew like a secret it couldn't keep. Darius crouched, his fingers tracing the frayed wires with the gentle precision of someone who knew exactly how much damage a single spark could do. He had lived through that once. He didn't plan on letting anyone else see their world go up in flames. But even as he worked, there was something in the hush of that house, in the warmth that bled through the crack of a door at the end of the hall. A light that wasn't flickering from bad wiring, but steady and deliberate, a glow that didn't belong in a place so silent. Darius hesitated, fingers tightening around his tools. He didn't have to check. He could finish the job, report back, and leave this place and its quiet mysteries behind. But he had learned a long time ago that the most important things in life often came in moments like this. Moments that asked you to go a little further, to see what waited on the other side of a door you hadn't meant to open. So he stood, wiping his hands on his worn work pants, and moved toward the light. Whatever was waiting, he knew only one thing for sure. He wouldn't turn away from it. Not tonight. The closer Darius got to that warm light spilling out from beneath the door, the more he could feel the rhythm of his own heartbeat in his ears. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something deeper and more complicated. Curiosity, maybe. A sense that he was standing on the edge of something that had nothing to do with circuit overloads or overtime pay. He paused with his hand on the door, feeling the smooth brass of the knob cold against his rough palm. He knocked once, a polite warning to whoever might be inside. Silence. But the light glowed steady, an amber beacon cutting through the darkness. Darius hesitated, then pushed the door open, just enough to see. She was there, standing barefoot in the middle of the room, a woman with long dark hair cascading over the soft white of her nightdress. She didn't startle, didn't flinch, just looked at him with eyes that held 1,000 quiet storms. Isa Whitmore. He didn't know her name then, but he knew the shape of her grief. It was a shape he recognized in his own reflection, the one he carried in the lines around his mouth and the shadows beneath his eyes. The room was beautiful in a way that didn't feel lived in. Heavy drapes, a fireplace gone cold, a grand piano sitting in the corner like a monument to something that used to be. The light came from an old lamp on a side table, its glow soft and golden, painting the woman's pale skin in warm relief against the hush of the house. "I'm sorry," Darius said, stepping back. His voice was low, respectful. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm just here for the wiring." She raised a hand, a slow, deliberate motion that wasn't a wave or a dismissal, more like a pause, a breath suspended between them. Her lips parted, the words caught in her throat for a moment before she let them out in a whisper so soft he almost didn't hear it. "Stay," she said. "Stay until it's over." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an order. It was a confession, wrapped in the kind of vulnerability that pressed against the ribcage like a heartbeat. And Darius, who had spent most of his life moving through the world like a ghost in steel-toed boots and coveralls, felt something in him soften at the edges. He should have said no, should have turned and left, should have done what every instinct and every training manual told him to do: finish the job, write the report, walk away. But there was something in her voice, something that cracked like ice thawing in the first warmth of spring. He knew that sound. He'd heard it in his daughter's tiny voice the night she woke up crying in the dark, scared of the world closing in around her. He'd heard it in his own chest the day the doctor said, benign, but no promises. So he stepped further into the room, just a few feet past the doorway. The door clicked shut behind him, not with a bang, but with a gentle finality, a punctuation at the end of a sentence neither of them had written. "I'm Darius," he said quietly, feeling the weight of his name in this place of polished floors and ghostly memories. She nodded once, her eyes still locked on his. Isa. They didn't ask the obvious questions, didn't ask why he stayed, or why she needed him to. Outside, the storm beat against the windows, but inside the room, time seemed to slow, pooling around them in the soft golden light. It wasn't romance. It wasn't thrill. It was something older and deeper, recognition maybe. The kind that said, I see you. I see your tired hands, your quiet strength, your unspoken fears. And in that fragile quiet, Darius found himself standing not as an intruder, but as a witness. A man who knew how to fix what others had broken, who had learned that sometimes the most important repairs had nothing to do with wires or tools. They didn't speak again for a long while, and in that silence, Darius understood something he'd almost forgotten. Sometimes the best thing you can offer someone isn't a solution. It's simply to stay. Shall we move to part 3 next? Let me know if you want me to adjust or keep weaving it forward. The hush in that room felt like a blanket, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Darius stood near the doorway, his calloused hands hanging by his sides, while Isa sat in an armchair by the fireplace that hadn't known warmth in years. She didn't look away. Instead, she studied him, his broad shoulders beneath the faded work jacket, the quiet determination in his eyes, the skin of a man who had never been invited to rooms like this, but whose presence felt honest in a way that cut through the air like a knife. The storm outside beat an erratic rhythm against the windows, but inside, there was only the slow, steady breathing of two people who didn't know how to name the ache they shared. Darius shifted slightly, his boots scuffing the ancient wood floor. "The electrical panel's a mess," he said finally, his deep voice calm, but edged with a craftsman's concern. "Dangerous. I should finish the repairs before it sparks again." "You can," Isa said, her voice low, soft but certain. "But stay after." The words fell between them like an offering, small but powerful. Darius paused, searching her face. Why, he wanted to ask, but he didn't. Some questions were better left in the quiet because the answers were already there, stitched into the way she sat so still, the way her fingers twitched against the fabric of her nightdress like she was holding something fragile and precious. Instead, he gave a single nod and turned back to the hallway, his tools in hand. As he worked, he felt the house around him, a place built for wealth and power, now hollowed out by secrets. He tightened connections, tested circuits, his dark hands moving with the careful precision of a man who understood how quickly a life could burn if you didn't pay attention. But in the back of his mind, Isa's whispered invitation echoed. Stay. Stay until it's over. 15 minutes later, he returned to the room, his jacket damp with sweat and rain, his boots left by the door out of respect. In one hand, he held a small toolkit, the other braced against the doorframe. Isa looked up at him, her eyes shadowed, but her posture relaxed, like she'd been waiting for him to step back into the circle of lamplight she'd drawn around herself. "I figured I'd check this lamp too," Darius said, gesturing to the antique floor lamp beside her. "It's buzzing, bad wiring." She nodded and moved aside, the rustle of silk on the worn rug the only sound in the room. Darius crouched by the lamp, the scent of old brass and electricity rising around him. His fingers, steady and skilled, traced the cracked base, the frayed cord. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He knew some things needed a gentle touch to be set right. Isa watched him, her breathing slow and measured. She saw the patience in him, the quiet strength. It was a kind of dignity she hadn't seen in years, not in the boardrooms her father used to fill with laughter that never reached his eyes, not in the glib smiles of men who saw her only as a name to inherit. "How old is your daughter?" she asked softly. Darius didn't look up right away, his broad shoulders blocking the lamp's light as he worked. 8. Emmy, she's the reason I'm here. The reason for everything." "She has your eyes," Isa said gently. He paused, the tool in his hand stilling for a breath. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice soft. "She's recovering from brain surgery, a tumor pressing on her optic nerve. It was benign, but it changed everything." Isa nodded slowly, her own eyes shimmering with something like understanding. "That's why you work nights," she said quietly. Darius's shoulders lifted in a tired half shrug. "Every extra job helps. Insurance only goes so far, and she sleeps better knowing I'm not far away." Isa reached for something on the small side table, a music box, its edges worn, the metal latch tarnished. "My mother used to play this for me when I couldn't sleep," she said. She wound it carefully, the soft melody drifting out like a ghost of the past, filling the space between them. For a moment, they didn't speak, didn't need to. The music was enough, weaving their stories together, hers of inherited legacies she never wanted, his of small acts of love that kept a little girl's world turning, even on the nights when his own was falling apart. Finally, Darius looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Sometimes it takes someone else to turn the light back on," he said, the faintest hint of a smile curving his lips. Isa smiled back, a smile that was small and fragile, but real. And in that quiet, Darius realized that he wasn't just fixing wires. He was mending something else, something he didn't have a name for yet, but that felt truer than any job he'd ever done. As the final notes of the music box faded, the hush that fell between them was tender, almost reverent. Darius rose from his crouch, standing tall in the dimly lit room, the warm glow of the fixed lamp casting shadows that danced along the floor. Issa's eyes traced the line of his shoulders, the set of his jaw. This man who had stepped into her world by accident, yet somehow felt like the only person who truly saw her. "I should head out," Darius said softly, breaking the silence like he was afraid to disturb it too much. "It's late, and I'm sure you'd rather have your space." Issa looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she reached for a small ivory card on the desk beside her. Her fingers moved with quiet purpose, as if the act of writing was something sacred. When she finished, she handed the card to him, her gaze steady. "Come back in the daylight," she said, "if you still believe I'm worth saving." The words hit Darius in the chest, a soft impact that settled deep and refused to be shaken off. He took the card, feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of her invitation. She didn't plead, she didn't beg, she just offered. And for a man who had spent years carrying burdens he never asked for, that small act of choice felt bigger than anything else in that grand, silent house. He tucked the card into his jacket pocket with care, like something precious. "I'll see you," he said simply. As he left, the storm had quieted to a drizzle, the world outside hushed and waiting. Darius stood on the front steps for a moment, breathing in the scent of wet earth and old roses. The mansion loomed behind him, a monument to a family that had built its walls to keep the world out. But inside, in one softly lit room, something had shifted, something that felt like the start of a story neither of them had planned. When he got back to his modest duplex on the edge of town, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the rooftops. Darius sat in his truck for a while, staring at the ivory card resting on the seat beside him. "Come back in the daylight if you still believe I'm worth saving." He didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. But as he let the quiet wash over him, he realized that maybe it wasn't about answers at all. Maybe it was about the choice to show up, to stand in the doorway of someone else's darkness and not look away. Inside the house, Emmy was still asleep, her small frame curled beneath the quilt. Darius stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, watching her breathe. She was his whole world, his reason for every late night and every early morning. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt the flicker of something just for him, something that said it was okay to want more than just survival. He closed the door quietly, the soft click of the latch a promise. Then he leaned against the hallway wall, the card still warm in his hand, and let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, light could find him too. The next morning, the city was bathed in the soft glow of early summer light. Darius moved through his small kitchen, the weight of the night before lingering in the quiet hum of the coffee maker and the gentle creak of the old wooden floor. Emmy was already up, still in her pajamas, drawing a picture of a raccoon in a top hat at the little table by the window. She looked up and grinned when he kissed the top of her head. "You look tired, Daddy," she said, the words simple and matter-of-fact, but somehow impossibly kind. "I am," he admitted with a low chuckle. "But I had a long night. Fancy house, lots of old wires." "Did you meet a princess?" she asked, tilting her head like she was weighing the possibility. Darius paused for a beat, then smiled. Something like that. He didn't tell her about Issa, or the way her eyes had looked in the lamplight, or how her whispered invitation had settled in his chest like an ember refusing to die out. Those were grown-up things, too heavy for a little girl who still believed in fairy tales and bedtime stories. But he carried them with him as he washed dishes and packed Emmy's lunch, the quiet knowledge that the night had changed him in ways he didn't yet understand. By noon, Darius was back in his garage, sleeves rolled up, sweat slicking his temples as he worked on an old neighbor's car. The hood was up, engine exposed like a puzzle, and he moved with the quiet focus of a man who had learned to fix what others discarded. That was his way of making sense of the world, one stripped wire, one leaky gasket at a time. But in the back of his mind, Issa's face stayed with him, the curve of her shoulders in that nightdress, the way her voice had sounded when she said, "Stay until it's over." He could feel the weight of her words even now, like a question he hadn't answered yet. "Why haven't you seen the garden lady again?" Emmy's small voice cut through his thoughts as she wandered into the garage, a crayon smudge on her cheek. He blinked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Because she has her own life, and I have mine," he said, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't the whole truth. Emmy considered this, her little brow furrowed. "She came to the hospital," she reminded him. "She didn't have to." "I know," he said softly. Emmy gave him a look that was all childhood wisdom and quiet wonder. "Then maybe she's already in your life," she said, her voice gentle and matter-of-fact, like she was talking about the sun or the way flowers always turn to the light. Darius didn't know how to answer that, so he just nodded, his throat tight, and went back to work. But as he moved, his hands steady and sure, he realized that maybe Emmy was right. Maybe sometimes the light you needed didn't come from the fixtures you spent your nights repairing. Maybe it came from the way someone saw you when you didn't expect it. Someone who looked at you and didn't see a stranger or a job to be done, but a man worth knowing, worth staying for. That night, as the city lights flickered on outside his window, Darius sat at the table with Emmy's picture in his hands. A raccoon in a top hat, smiling out at the world. He thought about Isa's words, about the card still tucked in his jacket pocket, about the invitation that wasn't really an invitation at all, but a chance to choose something real. And for the first time in a long while, he let himself want that. Not because he needed to be saved, but the next morning, the air felt different. Darius woke up before the sun had fully risen, the soft gold of dawn creeping through the blinds in his bedroom. Emmy still slept in her little bed across the hall, her breath a quiet rhythm he had come to rely on more than anything else in this world. He watched her for a moment, her small hand curled around the stuffed koala she never let go of, and then he rose, careful not to wake her. He showered and shaved, took an extra moment to polish his boots and press the collar of his shirt. It wasn't for her, he told himself. It was for him. Because maybe he wanted to show up in that grand, echoing house, not as a man called to fix something, but as a man who had chosen to stand in the light of something he didn't yet understand. By the time he pulled up to Willow Creek Drive, the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the mansion's white columns in soft light. He sat in the truck for a moment, the engine idling, the card she had given him resting in the passenger seat. "Come back in the daylight if you still believe I'm worth saving." He didn't know what he believed, not really. But he knew he was here, and that had to be enough for now. When he finally stepped up to the front door, his heart thudded loud in his chest. He knocked once, firm, but not demanding. The wait felt like forever. And then the door eased open, not by staff, not by some assistant, but by Isa herself. She wore jeans and a soft sweater, her hair pulled up in a loose knot. There were no pearls or designer dresses this morning, just a woman standing barefoot in her own home, her eyes bright with surprise and something like relief. "You came back," she said softly, as if testing the weight of the words in the air. "I still believe," Darius said simply, holding up the card. Isa's shoulders dropped, the faintest smile curling her lips. "I made coffee," she said, "but it's terrible." Darius let out a quiet laugh, a sound that felt like something he hadn't heard in a long time. "Lucky for you," he said, stepping inside. "I come with tools." She led him through the wide, sunlit hallways, her bare feet quiet against the marble floors. There was no pretense this time, no masks to wear. Just two people, each carrying their own quiet fears, each daring to hope that maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone in the weight of it all. In the kitchen, the coffee was as bad as she'd warned, thin and bitter and vaguely burnt. But Darius drank it anyway, not for the taste, but for the simple act of sharing it with her. They sat at the long kitchen island, the morning light spilling through the tall windows, dust motes dancing in the air like confetti. Isa ran her fingers around the rim of her mug, her posture relaxed but her eyes still sharp. "This kitchen has been remodeled 3 times, she said absently. "My father thought modern spaces kept the mind sharp, but the coffee machine's from the 90s and I've never figured out how to replace the filter." Darius gave her a small smile. "It's got character," he said. "So do you." She looked at him, her lips parting like she was going to argue, then just let out a soft laugh. It was a small sound, but it cracked the careful stillness around them, let something warmer and wilder seep in. For a long moment, they just sat there, 2 lives that didn't fit together on paper, sharing burnt coffee and unspoken understanding. And in that quiet, Darius realized something he hadn't let himself believe in a long time, that sometimes showing up wasn't about fixing something that was broken. Sometimes it was about standing beside someone else in the dark and saying, "I see you." Isa's laugh settled into the warm hush of the kitchen, a small, real thing that felt like it had been missing for far too long. She took a sip of her coffee, wincing a little at the taste, then set the mug down gently, her fingers tracing the edge as if she was gathering her thoughts. "I read the letter the night of the memorial," she said softly, her gaze distant for a moment. "I didn't open it at first. I thought maybe, if I waited long enough, the words would change, like grief had a grace period." Darius watched her carefully, his strong hands resting on the table, palms open like he was offering something he couldn't name. "And when you did open it?" he asked, his voice low and even, patient in the way only someone who had spent years listening to other people's pain could be. She met his eyes then, the faintest tremor in her breath. "It said the inheritance transfers to me, everything, the whole empire, but only if I'm married by my 33rd birthday." Her lips twitched in a humorless smile. "Which is tomorrow?" Darius felt the quiet weight of her words settle over them, heavy and unfair. "That's a hell of a deadline," he said, his voice tinged with something that was part disbelief and part quiet rage at a world that would still trade a woman's freedom for respectability. "It's not illegal," Issa said with a dry little laugh, "just cruel and perfectly enforceable, thanks to the best lawyers money could buy." She looked at him again, her shoulders squared, even as her voice wavered. "My father didn't just want a legacy. He wanted it to look a certain way, married, controlled, respectable." Darius leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "That's not a legacy," he said simply. "That's a leash." The words hung between them, raw and honest in a way that made Isa blink, as if no one had ever dared to say them out loud before. "You're the first person who said that," she whispered. "Everyone else just pities me." "I don't think you want pity," Darius said. "I think you want someone to see it for what it is." The air between them shifted, the quiet growing deeper, more intimate. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, lighting the kitchen in soft gold, but in that moment, it felt like there was nothing in the world but the two of them and the truths they were finally brave enough to speak. Isa's shoulders relaxed just a fraction, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Last night, when you walked into that room, I wasn't waiting for anyone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just couldn't move, couldn't sleep. I felt like I was made of glass." "And now?" he asked gently. She let out a shaky breath, her lips curling into the faintest, most fragile smile. "Now, it's like someone turned on a light inside." Darius felt his own breath catch, not because he had fixed anything, not really, but because he understood. He had felt it too, the way darkness could settle into the bones, the way a single moment of kindness could crack it open like dawn breaking after a long night. He didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. In the soft glow of that kitchen, surrounded by cracked tiles and the smell of burnt coffee, they simply sat in the quiet of two people who had nothing left to hide. And for Darius, that was enough. After a while, Isa rose from her seat, her bare feet silent on the cool tile floor. "Come with me," she said softly. There was no hesitation in her voice, only a quiet resolve. Darius stood and followed, his boots scuffed but polished, the faint smell of coffee and old wiring clinging to him like a second skin. They moved through the hallways of the mansion, past portraits of men in tailored suits, her family's legacy staring down at them with cold, painted eyes. Isa didn't linger on them. She walked with purpose, her steps steady as she led him down a narrow hallway he hadn't noticed before. At the end of it stood a door painted a pale blue, its brass handle worn from years of use. Isa paused there, her fingers brushing the wood, as if greeting an old friend she hadn't dared to see in years. "This was my mother's study," she said, her voice low, reverent. "I haven't been inside since she died." Darius watched her carefully, the quiet strength in her posture as she drew a small key from around her neck. She fitted into the lock, the faint click loud in the hush of the house. The door swung open with a sigh, revealing a room bathed in morning light. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams filtering through the tall windows, and the scent of lavender, faded but still sweet, hung in the air. A grand piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with time. On a low table, a crystal inkwell gleamed beside a stack of old letters. Isa stepped inside first, her fingers trailing along the edge of a bookshelf crowded with worn volumes. I used to sneak in here when I was little, she said, her voice almost a whisper. My mother would pretend not to see me. She'd just keep playing, and I'd sit on the rug and listen. Darius moved further into the room, his gaze settling on a small lamp with a frayed cord perched on the desk. He crouched, his instincts as a craftsman taking over. This switch is old, he said quietly. May I? Isa nodded, her hands wrapped around her elbows as she watched him. He worked in silence, his broad hands steady as he tightened the connections, adjusted the socket. A small, familiar rhythm, one he had known since he was a boy, learning how to fix the things his father left broken. Finally, he flicked the switch. The bulb glowed a warm, golden light, filling the room with a gentle radiance. Isa let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. I thought it was broken forever, she said, her voice trembling. Most things aren't, Darius said, his tone quiet but sure. They just need someone who knows where to look. For a moment, neither of them moved. The light glowed between them, soft and steady. And in its glow, the air felt warmer, safer. Isa took a slow breath, then crossed to the window seat, sinking onto the cushion with a grace that came not from money or breeding, but from finally allowing herself to rest. Darius sat beside her, their knees almost touching. Outside, the world was waking up, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Inside, it felt like the mansion itself was holding its breath, like it knew this was a moment it didn't want to break. Isa turned to him, her eyes bright. What happens if I don't sign anything tomorrow? She asked, her voice soft but steady. You lose the company, he said. The trust, the name, maybe. And what do I keep? Yourself, Darius said, the word heavy with truth. That might be worth more than all of it. She smiled then, a real smile, one that reached her eyes and softened the sharp lines of her face. You're the first person who doesn't look at me like a puzzle to solve, she said. I don't want to solve you, Darius said, his voice low, sure. I just want to see you. The light from the lamp they had fixed together spilled around them, and for the first time in years, Isa felt like she could breathe without having to perform. For a long while, they sat in the gentle glow of the restored lamp, the only sound the distant sigh of wind through the old eaves. Darius didn't try to fill the silence. He let it stretch between them, as patient and steady as his own breathing, because he understood that some spaces weren't meant to be crowded with words. Isa leaned back against the window, her hands folded in her lap, her bare feet tucked beneath her like a girl lost in a storybook. Everyone around me keeps asking who I'll marry, she said finally, her voice calm but edged with something fragile. Which businessman, which partner, as if this is just another transaction, another line on a ledger. And you? Darius asked quietly. I don't want a transaction, she said, meeting his gaze. I want something real, even if it's small, even if it's messy and quiet and doesn't come with headlines. He held her eyes, his own steady and warm. I can't offer much, he said honestly. I don't have money or titles. I've got calloused hands and nights that don't always have enough sleep. I've got a little girl who is my entire world, and bills that come before everything else. That's my life. Isa didn't flinch, didn't look away. You're good with broken lamps, she said softly, a hint of a smile on her lips. And broken silences. She reached out then, not for romance, not for reassurance, but for the simple truth of touch. Her hand found his, their fingers interlacing like threads that had been waiting for each other. I don't know what tomorrow brings, she whispered, but thank you for showing up in the dark when I didn't know I needed it. He squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for letting me stay, he said, the words simple but heavy with everything he couldn't quite say out loud. In that moment, the air between them felt different, less like the careful hush of strangers and more like the quiet of two people who understood that sometimes just being present was the most powerful thing you could do. When Darius finally stood to leave, Isa rose with him. They didn't linger on goodbyes or promises. Instead, they shared a small, quiet look that spoke of new beginnings, of second chances and soft light in forgotten rooms. Outside, the sun had climbed high, the day bright and alive in a way that felt like a kind of permission. Darius walked back to his truck with Isa's hand resting for a moment on the doorframe, her fingers pressing gently, like she was grounding herself in the choice she'd made to let him in. As he drove away, the mansion receded in his rearview mirror, a house of old ghosts and cold portraits, but somewhere inside it, a woman had chosen to open a door, And in that choice, Darius felt a small, fierce hope spark inside him. He didn't know if he was part of her future. He didn't know if she was part of his. But he knew that for one quiet morning, they had both laid down their masks and said, "I see you." And for Darius, that was enough. That afternoon, Darius found himself back in the small garage that had become both sanctuary and necessity, the space where he let his hands speak the language of care and precision. A car hood was propped open, the engine a maze of metal and memory, but his mind was only half there. Part of him was still in that sunlit kitchen, still hearing Issa's voice saying she didn't want a transaction. She wanted something real. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow, his dark skin glistening in the dusty light that slanted through the garage window. The world outside moved on, cars rushing by, neighbors calling to one another from across the street. But for Darius, time felt different, slower, like it was waiting for him to catch up to something that had already begun. Emmy wandered in from the back door, her small hand sticky from an ice pop she'd found in the freezer. "Daddy," she said around a mouthful of cherry red, "why do you look like you're thinking so hard?" He chuckled low, ruffling her curls. "I guess I am, baby, just thinking about how sometimes the most important things in life don't look like much on paper." She frowned, scrunching up her nose. "Like what?" "Like a light that stays on when you're scared," he said. "Or a person who doesn't run when you're falling apart." Emmy considered this with the solemn seriousness only a child could muster. "Like you," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You stay." Darius's throat tightened. "Yeah," he said quietly, crouching so he was eye level with her. "Like me." Later that evening, after Emmy had fallen asleep in a nest of blankets and stuffed animals, Darius sat in the quiet of his living room, Isa's card resting on the table in front of him. He traced the words with a fingertip. "Come back in the daylight if you still believe I'm worth saving." He thought about Isa, about the way her hand had felt in his, warm and sure, about the way she had looked at him like he was more than the sum of his late nights and tired hands. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one being saved. He picked up the card and slipped it into his jacket pocket again. Not because he needed a reminder of her words, but because he wanted to carry that promise with him, close to his chest, where he kept the things that mattered most. When he stepped outside into the cool night air, he looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky, each one a small light, fighting to be seen. He took a breath, steady and deep, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure where this would lead, or what tomorrow might demand of him, but he knew one thing for certain. He was done hiding in the dark. The night was deep and quiet by the time Darius finally sat down on the worn couch in his living room, the soft creak of the springs beneath him, grounding in its familiarity. He'd left the front porch light on, a small beacon in the darkness that had always felt like a promise to Emmy. No matter how far he went, he'd always come back. He rested his head against the back of the couch, closing his eyes for a moment. In his mind, he saw Isa's face lit by the warm glow of that old lamp, the way her voice had softened when she said, "I want something real." He thought about how, in her words, he'd heard an echo of his own heart, the quiet wish he'd never spoken out loud. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a name that made his chest tighten. Isa. For a moment he hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone. Then he picked it up, his deep voice calm, even though he felt anything but. "Hey, hey," she said back, her voice a soft exhale, like she'd been holding her breath all day. I wasn't sure if I should call." "I'm glad you did," he said simply. On the other end of the line, there was a small pause. Then Isa spoke again, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "I almost signed the papers today," she confessed, "the ones that would give it all back, the company, the money, everything. I thought, maybe if I let it go, I'd be free." "And now?" Darius asked. She let out a breath that sounded like relief and sorrow all at once. "Now I'm realizing freedom isn't about having nothing. It's about having the right something, something you choose." Darius's lips curved into a small, quiet smile. "Even if it's messy?" "Especially if it's messy," Isa said, a hint of laughter in her voice. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was different now, not empty, but full of everything they weren't saying out loud, the way they both carried old ghosts in their pockets, the way they'd both learned to find light in the smallest corners. I'm coming back tomorrow, Darius said finally, his voice firm. Not because I have to, because I want to. I know, Issa whispered. That's why it matters. When they hung up, Darius leaned back against the couch, his phone still warm in his hand. Outside, the night was thick with the scent of summer, cut grass, damp earth, the faint sweetness of honeysuckle. He sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet, and let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't standing at the edge of something impossible. Maybe he was already in it, one small choice at a time. In the soft hush of that night, Darius felt the truth settle in his bones. He wasn't saving Issa. She wasn't saving him. But together, they were choosing to stay, and sometimes that was the most important light of all. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of June sky that felt like a promise. Darius woke to the quiet hum of the city beyond his window, the scent of coffee already filling the small kitchen. He moved through the morning rituals, brushing Emmy's curls, packing her lunch, the small tendernesses that stitched their lives together, one sunrise at a time. But even as he tied Emmy's sneakers and listened to her chatter about school and raccoon drawings, a part of him was already standing in front of Issa's door, hearing her say, "Come back in the daylight." When he finally pulled up to Willow Creek Drive, the mansion looked almost gentle in the early light. No storm clouds, no haunted shadows, just a house waiting for a new story to be written inside its walls. Darius took a steadying breath, his hand resting on the wheel. Then he climbed out of the truck, his boots solid on the clean gravel. This time, he didn't hesitate. He knocked, and when the door opened, Issa was already there, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, her eyes warm in the morning sun. She wore a simple linen dress, her bare feet peeking out beneath the hem. "You came back," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I did," Darius said simply, and in those two words, there was 1,000 things he couldn't say. "I see you. I choose you. I'm not afraid of what this could be." Issa smiled then, a small, real smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I made muffins," she said, holding up a brown paper bag. "I'm a terrible baker, but I thought breakfast was a better way to start than contracts." Darius chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Breakfast sounds perfect." They stepped into the kitchen together, the air filled with the soft scent of cinnamon and something else, something hopeful. They didn't talk much as they ate the lopsided muffins, didn't need to. It wasn't about the food or even the words. It was about the quiet presence they shared in that sunlit room, the gentle weight of two people who had decided that showing up was enough. When they finished, Issa set her coffee cup down, her fingers tracing the rim in slow circles. "Do you know what I almost did this morning?" she asked, her voice low. Darius looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "What?" "I almost signed those papers, almost gave it all back just to be free. But then I realized freedom isn't the same as having nothing. It's about choosing the something you want to build." He reached across the table then, his hand covering hers. "Even if it's small," he said, "even if it's messy." "Especially if it's messy," she whispered, and in her smile he saw the quiet courage that had been there all along, waiting for the light to find it. Outside, the world moved on, cars driving past, birds calling to each other in the bright morning air. But inside that kitchen, time seemed to slow, to bend around them like it was giving them this one perfect moment. Darius didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if this was the start of something, or just a single bright chapter in the middle of their lives, but he knew that he was here and that he wasn't going anywhere. And in the quiet, warm hush of that morning, that was enough. After breakfast, Issa led Darius outside, through the grand back doors that opened onto a garden just beginning to bloom again after years of neglect. The air smelled of damp earth and roses, the petals bright and defiant against the dark, rich soil. Issa walked barefoot on the flagstone path, her linen dress brushing her ankles, her hand grazing the tops of the roses like a prayer. "My mother planted these," she said, her voice a soft echo of memory. "She used to say that even the most beautiful things need a little wildness to survive." Darius watched her, the way she moved with quiet reverence through this small, forgotten Eden. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the grace in the way she didn't flinch from the thorns. "I think she was right," he said. Isa turned to him then, her eyes bright in the morning sun. Do you think something can be beautiful even if it's not perfect?" He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking like a sigh. "I think the most beautiful things are the ones that refuse to be perfect," he said, his voice low and sure. The ones that survive anyway. She smiled at that, a small, real smile that felt like a bloom in itself. I want to build something here, she said. Not for profit, not for legacy, just a place where people can breathe, a place where they can be seen. Darius nodded, his dark eyes soft. You've already started, he said. You did it the moment you opened the door to me. They stood there for a moment, the garden around them quiet and alive, the air heavy with the scent of possibility. Issa reached down, brushing a fallen rose petal from the path. You're good with your hands, she said softly, her gaze meeting his. And with everything else, too. He let out a quiet laugh, the sound low and warm in the morning air. I fix things, he said simply. It's what I've always known how to do. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing his. Not everything can be fixed, she said, her voice trembling just a little. But maybe some things don't need to be. Maybe they just need someone to stand beside them while they bloom. Darius reached out then, his hand finding hers, his touch steady and warm. I can do that, he said. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I can be here. I can stay. Isa nodded, her smile soft and sure. That's all I need, she said. And in the quiet of that garden, surrounded by the soft murmur of growing things and the bright, hopeful bloom of roses, they stood together, two people who had been broken and bent and buried in the darkness, but who had chosen, again and again, to reach for the light. The next day, Darius and Issa stood in front of the small storefront she'd inherited. A building that had sat empty for years, its cracked windows and faded sign, a quiet testament to the way dreams could slip through the cracks of time. But this morning, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. They stood side by side, Emmy's small hand tucked into Darius's, her eyes wide with curiosity as she took in the dusty floors and old shelves waiting to be filled. Issa turned to them, her dark hair pulled back, her linen shirt dusted with sawdust. I want this place to be more than just a business, she said. I want it to be a home for stories, for quiet, for light. Darius smiled, his broad shoulders relaxing in a way they hadn't for years. Then let's start, he said simply. Emmy wandered over to a bare wall, her small fingers tracing the faded paint. Can I help? She asked, her voice full of shy excitement. Isa knelt beside her, her eyes soft. Of course you can, she said. You can lead the decorating committee. Emmy grinned, her gap-toothed smile bright in the morning sun. I want a reading corner with beanbags, she said, already seeing the shape of things to come. Darius laughed, the sound low and warm. That's the best idea I've heard all day, he said, ruffling her curls. They spent the morning cleaning and measuring, Issa sketching out plans on scraps of paper, while Darius tightened old light fixtures and sanded down shelves that had known more years than either of them. Emmy busied herself with a box of chalk, drawing bright flowers and crooked stars on the cracked floor. Every mark was a small, defiant act of hope. At noon, Issa brought out sandwiches, her hands shaking just a little as she offered them. I haven't done this in years, she said, a wry smile on her lips. I forgot how good it feels to build something with your own hands. Darius took the sandwich from her, his fingers brushing hers in a silent promise. It's not about the sandwiches, he said. It's about the choice to stay. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the way her shoulders eased, the way the lines around her mouth softened. You make me believe this could work, she said, her voice quiet. He reached for her hand, his grip gentle but sure. It's not about perfect, he said. It's about real. And in that dusty storefront, with sunlight streaming through the cracked glass and laughter echoing off the bare walls, they laid the first brick of something that wasn't just a cafe. It was a testament that even the most broken spaces could be mended if you were brave enough to stay. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet unfolding, a slow dance of small, hopeful steps. Darius found himself at the storefront most days after finishing his other jobs, sleeves rolled up and hair damp with sweat, rewiring fixtures and patching up the walls with the same steady care he'd given his daughter's nursery years ago. Emmy came with him, her laughter bright as she filled the corners of the old shop with chalk drawings and tiny wishes. And Issa was always there, her hair pulled back, her hands streaked with paint, her smile soft but sure, as she took measure of the space and the dreams it could hold. They worked together in the hush of those mornings and afternoons, the quiet punctuated only by the scrape of sandpaper and the low murmur of music playing from an old radio in the window. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the dusty storefront glowed with the promise of possibility, Isa stood beside Darius at the door. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, her eyes catching the last light of the day. "I've never built something like this," she said, her voice quiet. "Not for a company, not for a legacy, just for me, for us." Darius looked at her, his dark eyes gentle but certain. "Then let it be real," he said. "Let it be something that doesn't need to be perfect, just honest." That night, they lit the sign that hung above the door, Second Light, painted in hand-drawn letters by Isa herself. The glow from the newly rewired lamp spilled out onto the street, soft and golden, catching in the window like a quiet declaration. We're here. We're open, even when no one's watching. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee and lavender polish. The mismatched chairs they had rescued from secondhand shops sat around tables that still bore the nicks and scratches of other lives. On the walls, Emmy's chalk drawings bloomed like wildflowers, bright and defiant. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. On opening day, neighbors drifted in slowly, drawn by the soft light and the scent of fresh muffins. A woman in her 70s claimed the corner window seat with her knitting bag, her needles clicking in the hush of morning. A young father sat with his son by the children's nook, the boy's laughter weaving through the air like a bright thread. Darius moved through the space, his shoulders loose, his steps sure. Isa watched him from behind the counter, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug. And when he caught her eye, he smiled, small but full of everything they hadn't said. Later that night, when Emmy had fallen asleep in a nest of blankets behind the counter, Darius found Isa standing outside, her face tilted up to the sign that glowed against the dark. She didn't speak at first, just reached for his hand and held it in the quiet. "You know," she said finally, her voice soft, "I didn't think I could ever let someone in like this. Not after everything, not after the way it all fell apart." Darius squeezed her hand gently. "I didn't think I could either," he said. "But here we are." She looked at him then, her eyes bright with something he recognized in his own heart, hope and the courage to choose it again and again. "Then let's stay," she whispered, "even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm in the cool night air. "I will," he said, "for as long as it takes." And in that promise, quiet, real, and spoken in the soft glow of the second light, they began. Not with grand declarations or flawless plans, but with the simple, steady choice to stand in the light and stay. Thank you for joining us on this journey of quiet hope and second chances. In the soft glow of forgotten spaces, two lives found the courage to begin again, reminding us all that even in the darkest hours, light can be rebuilt, one gentle choice at a time. If this story spoke to your heart or made you think about the small, quiet ways we heal and grow, please consider sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine a light on the human spirit. Until next time, stay open, stay present, and keep choosing the light.